For us, guys. Kurt Kuntz is actually going to introduce our speaker, but I was talking to Dr. Newman out there, and I thought it might be a little self-serving, but he said, I hope you'll tell this story. The pediatric surgeon that trained Dr. Newman is one of the iconic, wonderful people that I've known in my life, and on top of that happened to be a surgeon named Judd Randolph. And Judd was a Tennessean, grew up in Nashville. I was born down in Georgia, but grew up in Nashville. And he was the first visiting professor that we had here after I came here at the ripe age of 33 to take over the program. And I'd already had some issues with administrative people and others over progress that we needed to make, and was feeling a little bit exposed about it. And he and I were walking across the parking lot. Now, there was this iconic pediatric surgeon, and I said to him, his roommate in medical school was a local orthopedic surgeon named Bennett Corrin, and they were very close. And we were walking across the parking lot, and I said, you know, he said, I know this is kind of tough when you've not had much experience. I said, yeah, it is. I said, you know, I just wish I could be more like Bennett Corrin when things like this, when things with pressure happen. And he stopped in the middle of the parking lot, got me by the arm, stopped, turned me around, looked at me, and he said, now, son, let me tell you something. I love Bennett Corrin like a brother. Absolutely love him, but you don't need to be like Bennett Corrin, because if you're like Bennett Corrin, this program ain't going anywhere. So you keep doing what you're doing. And from that point on, we shared a great relationship, and I think Dr. Newman may make some mention of him, but he was a wonderful individual, retired back to Nashville, actually, when he stopped practice, and got to see him quite a bit at that time. But Kurt Kuntz, would you introduce our speaker, please?
Thank you, Dr. Burns. It's my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Kurt Newman. I've known Dr. Newman basically since I've started my pediatric surgical career. Like Dr. Burns mentioned, he's got close ties to Tennessee. Although, like myself, he actually grew up in North Carolina. His father was a professor at North Carolina State University. And I know this is SEC territory, but we're ACC people. And you may or may not know that the rivalries in North Carolina are really North Carolina State, Chapel Hill, and Duke. So he was a fan of North Carolina State, obviously because of his father, but then he did his undergraduate education in Chapel Hill, and then to make it even more politically complicated, he went and did his medical education at Duke. Although you ask him, he'll still tell you he's a Carolina fan. So my wife would applaud that too, because that's where she went. He then went and did his surgical training at Brigham and Women's in Boston. And then, as Dr. Burns mentioned, he was fortunate enough to train under Dr. Judd Randolph down in D.C. Children's National in Washington, D.C. So just to give you guys a little bit of a historical background on pediatric surgery, and it was back in the 1900s. A surgeon named Dr. William Ladd was from Boston. There was a major fire and explosion up in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And he went up there to help take care of the injured, and it turned out there was a lot of injured children and infants. And he realized that there was a lack of surgical experience and training for those children. So he came back down and started pediatric surgery training in Boston. He then trained a close associate, Dr. Robert Gross, and they became sort of that's where the pediatric surgery started disseminating. And those guys, or those surgeons, trained several prolific surgeons, one of which was Dr. Randolph. He was actually Dr. Gross's 27th trainee. Dr. Randolph then went down and started the pediatric surgery training program in D.C. at Children's National. And it was then and still is one of the premier training programs in the country for pediatric surgical training. And that's then due a large part to Dr. Newman for carrying on his succession. And Dr. Newman has served as professor of surgery and pediatrics. He was surgeon-in-chief, senior vice president, and now he's currently the CEO and president of Children's National. He's a nationally recognized leader in pediatric health care. He's a prolific pediatric surgeon in an academic standpoint. Now he's a successful hospital administrator. He's been on numerous boards and committees. We could go on and on about this, but he told me to be short, so I'm going to. But also in his spare time, he's actually written a critically praised book. It's Healing Children, a Surgeon's Stories from the Frontiers of Pediatric Medicine. It is my great honor to introduce Dr. Kurt Newman. We appreciate you coming.
Well, thank you, Kurt. It's a little unusual when you have a name like Kurt to have to thank another Kurt, but it's a mark of a terrific friendship that I've had with Dr. Kuntz. That's one of the wonderful things about a specialty like pediatric surgery is you get to know people well, because there's just not that many of us, and I know Dr. Carr is here, and we've had a long time friendship too, and I want to acknowledge that. You know, it's amazing to also have an introduction by Dr. Burns, and I've admired him and what he's created here in terms of an academic surgical program and tradition. And then all the wonderful people that are supporting the hospital here and all the work that gets done, and your leadership team on the children's side with Don Mueller, and then the system, Kevin Spiegel. And Kevin, thank you, and Don, for being here. It's a little bit daunting. I didn't quite know what to talk about because Kurt said it to me on the other side. He said it kind of embarrassingly. He said, you know, now that you've gone over to the dark side, and maybe I have, but I'm trying to shine some light on now what it's like to be in leadership and bring the lessons of what I've learned as a surgeon to being a leader. So this may be a little different than the grand rounds you're used to having, but I would like to just make some observations about what I've learned as a surgeon that I try and apply now in a leadership role in one of the great children's hospitals, which is in Washington, D.C. I also want to thank the development team. They picked out a tie for me to wear. I don't know if this is the Erlanger tie, and I don't know if there's other shades of blue, but this happens to be Carolina blue, and I feel very good wearing that. And as Kurt said, I learned to bridge conflict very early in my career, and that's an important lesson, as I'm sure Dr. Burns felt when he was trying to get things started here, how to create partnerships, collaborations, friendships when people are used to competition and other ways of dealing with things. So just to establish my credentials, so that I was a surgeon. I just wanted to prove it. I knew how to, wear a mask and, get the hat just right. And I loved practicing surgery and was a surgeon. And I hate talking about it like it's in the past tense, but was a pediatric surgeon for over 30 years in Washington. And it was, I loved it. I had this opportunity 6 years ago to become the CEO of the hospital and take the knowledge that I've gained, and there I am now looking more like an executive. But I think being a surgeon is and being a physician is really what I look to in terms of leading our hospital. Just a little bit about our hospital. It's in Washington, D.C. I know a lot of people have different opinions about Washington, D.C., but it's been a great place to live, work, and bring up my family and practice surgery. And like Erlanger, we're a pediatric health system, an academic pediatric health system, and I very much admire what you're doing here because it's not easy. It's not easy to bring those missions together and make it all work. This is a little bit of a picture of our hospital. We've been in Washington, D.C. since right after the Civil War. Is that, I'm not sure, is that what you call it here? Or is it I've heard last night at a cocktail party they were calling it the War of Northern Aggression. But anyway, it's a big children's hospital, but by the sizes of health systems, you know, I put the beds and the number of employees and the number of physicians and nurses there. We're not that big. We're independent, and we're trying to do it on our own because for where we are in our market, that seems to be the best way to achieve the pediatric mission. I think you have a very, very exciting scenario here. It's not one that's very common around the country to have this relationship between the children's hospital and the adult hospital that seems to be working so well to provide opportunities in education and research and for children. Because as many of us know, the way our country provides the resources to care for children is difficult. A lot of it's Medicaid. You were telling me the number, 63% of your patients on the children's side of things are on Medicaid, which isn't frequently the best payer. I don't know about in Tennessee. That's a joke. You know, I bet it's not one of the top. Our hospital, it's about 55%. And so right off the bat, you're talking about having difficulty getting enough resources because even at the best situations, it doesn't cover the full cost of the care you're providing. So you're looking for other sources. Maybe the people that have money, maybe their philanthropy is often a big source, and I know that that's important here as well. Now, I was proud of our one helicopter, and here's everything about Children's National we call the Bear. So this is Air Bear. But I understand you have 6. It's like an Air Force. And so it's, but I understand why you probably need it here, the geography, and that's the same is true for Washington, D.C., just trying to be accessible to people and children all over. And then we have other pieces. I think one of the things that people don't realize that many children's hospitals are really the hub. The hospital is a hub of a big health system itself for children, and that's what we've tried to create with different outpatient centers and to be a resource for the entire community. Now, Dr. Burns mentioned Dr. Randolph, and coming to Tennessee, it would not be something that I would want to do and not mention him because he was such a formative, had such an informative impact on me. And here's Dr. Randolph. He was well known for being an extremely creative and innovative surgeon. And this is in 1977, so he'd been in Washington now about 13 years. He was the first, as Kurt mentioned, he was trained by Dr. Gross. He was the first pediatric surgeon in full-time in Washington, D.C. So what you have to remember, until the 60s and 70s, in many communities, pediatric surgery was performed by general surgeons. That was part of what general surgeons did. And most general surgeons had a lot of training in taking care of kids because they were the resource. So as pediatric surgery became a specialty in the 60s, 70s, it became more and more specialized, but not every community had a pediatric surgeon. And I'm not sure when the history here, when the first full-time, was it Dr. Carr back in probably the early 80s? 86, Michael. And that would change things, but a lot of communities weren't as welcoming and accepting. But and Dr. Randolph had his own issues, like Dr. Burns was mentioning here in Chattanooga about creating this, bringing this specialty because it was different. It was changed. And I was fortunate enough to train with him and the team there in beginning in 1984 for 2 years, and there was a terrific group of pediatric surgeons there. There's another one I'd like to mention. I don't have her in the presentation, but it was in my book. Was Dr. Catherine Anderson, who was another real force in American surgery. Went on from Washington to be the chief of surgery at the Children's Hospital of Los Angeles, and was the first woman president of the American College of Surgeons, and she's now retired. And she came in an era when women were not encouraged to go into surgery, in fact, discouraged. She was in Boston. She was told she couldn't be a surgeon, even more not a pediatric surgeon. And she found a home in Washington and built her career there. But anyway, this is Dr. Randolph. And he was just, he took on problems and issues that people in Washington and across the country, he was leading the way, and he taught me many lessons that stick with me to this day. And I did write a book, and this is not meant to sell my book, but if you're interested, just happen to have a copy. But it's all about stories of children, and a number of them came that I tell, and a lot of the influence I had came from Dr. Randolph. And so there was a baby that I was, as a fellow, was asked to take a look at by him, because this baby was named Jessica, and she had a bowel obstruction. And it was caused by a rare situation where she had 2 atresias. Now, and one atresia is not uncommon, but I mean, it's not that common, but you see it and you know what to do, and you just sew the ends of the bowel together. There's a lot of detail I don't want to go into, but this little girl baby had 2 atresias. So the surgeons that were taking care of her sewed the ends together that were right there, and she should have been fine. Everything should have opened up and all of that, but for months she didn't open up and was vomiting green. And there was a picture a little later, and I remember like it was yesterday. So I had come on as a young fellow. Dr. Randolph handed me her records and said, he said, you know, take a fresh look at this. Pretend nobody's looked at this baby before. And this was now about 6-7 months into this child. And she'd had exploratory surgeries, x-rays, you name it, to try and figure out why her bowels wouldn't work. And she was on TPN and all of that. So I remember standing in the NICU one day, and I just kind of thought back to what, and he kept pressing me. He said, have you figured it out yet? You know, have you figured it out yet? And you know, I couldn't figure it out. So one day I was just happened to be standing in the NICU, and I tried to visualize what the surgeons that took care of her, you know, what they saw when they got in there the first time. And it was like a thunderbolt, and it seems so simple now, was that with 2 blockages, what they'd done was just sew the ends together that were the closest together. But they hadn't taken account of the rotation the bowel goes through as part of normal neonatal development. So what had happened, I thought, was, well, maybe they actually sewed it in backwards. And you know, I just got so excited. Well, how could we prove it? I got a great radiologist, and I tell you, the relationships between surgeons and radiologists are so critical. And it kind of worries me now with everything, you know, online, and where you don't have that consultative back and forth relationship. That may not be true here, but that's certainly true where I just saw that change. But anyway, found the best, you know, there's always a go-to radiologist too. And I went to him, and he said, well, what we're going to do is put some contrast down below and follow it along up. And we're going to not stop. We're going to get it all the way up to that segment. Did that, and the contrast shot up backwards. And so that basically proved it. We went back in, took things apart, put it back together. About a week later, Jessica had her first bowel movement. The mother screamed, wanted to bronze the poop, and put it on the wall. And it seemed, unlikely, but that was the cause. It was a simple surgical, I hate to call it an error, because it was such an unusual situation. I told Dr. Randolph what had happened, and he said something that still sticks with me to this day. He said, never trust the notes. Never trust the notes. And what he was trying to impress on me with that is that sometimes you got to take a fresh look at things. And what you believe, sometimes stepping back and taking a fresh look at things is so important and can lead to fresh insights. And I think that as a surgeon was so important. And now as a CEO, it's easy to kind of get caught up in your decisions and, boy, this was the right thing to do and I'm going to stick with it and all that. But sometimes it's good to be humble and sort of step back and really test your assumptions. Dr. Randolph had a lot of other sayings. I told a little story last night. We'd be in a tough case, and all of a sudden he'd stop and say, "The ox is in the ditch." Now in Tennessee, you may know what that means. In Washington, we had no idea, but we knew we were in trouble. And then he'd just kind of take a step back, and I think this is what he was doing. He'd take a step back, go back to the wash basin, kind of wash his hands a little bit, and then take another look at things and come back very calm and with a whole new approach. He had another one, and I'm sorry to go on and on about him, but I just feel his presence here. I think Dr. Burns, I know how close you were to him. He would say something like a baby like Jessica, maybe. I think one of the great things about pediatric surgery and pediatrics is you get to see things over the long arc of a life. And you get engaged with these children and their families, and you just see the incredible potential that these children can have. And so he would say, on a situation like that, particularly after things had maybe straightened out and a child or baby had done well, he'd say something like, "You can't tell by looking at them how far a frog can jump." And, I saw a lot of frogs jumping. He was just amazing about how he could do that. Now, one of the things I'll tell you a little more about Jessica, which was when I was writing the book, I felt like I needed to find her and ask her about the story, what she remembered, whether it was okay to use this story. And she got so excited, and she came in, and it was just like this. She had no memory, obviously, and she'd had some issues over the years with some GI problems. But it was just, she had gone to college, and she was just a happy young woman. And I asked her about her mother, and her mother was the kind of person who, I don't know how many of these you might have on your floors, but you'd be making rounds at 6 in the morning. And she was perfectly made up. Everything was just right. And she was at that bedside taking care of that baby no matter what. And so I was talking to Jessica about her mom. And sadly, her mom had, a lot of times a crisis like she went through with her daughter drives people into really unfortunate situations. And she became an alcoholic and on drugs. And the sad thing for Jessica was she'd never ever seen her mother the way I saw her mother. And it was such a healing thing that I could tell her what her mother had meant to her and how she had really nursed her through this whole episode. And it was healing for both of us. And then she brought her mother to a book party that I was having, and it was just this incredible thing. And so, it's just one of the real satisfying things that I've had in my career is to have those relationships with families, and then be able to be a small part of a story like that. And I'm sure all of you as pediatricians and surgeons have your own stories like that. And it's just, it's really it's why we go into it. It's because you can have an impact like that. Another lesson that I've learned is to always, when you can, but I think it's important to embrace the parent's perspective. So in pediatrics, that's just so important. And as a CEO, I get a lot of letters. Kevin, Don, I'm sure you get a lot of letters. Most of them, the percentage is not praise. It's pointing something out. And this was a mother, Amanda Leland, who wrote me a letter that I got incredibly. She sent it perfectly to arrive on Valentine's Day. And here she is, and she's I used to call her the CEO of Oceans. She works for one of those big nonprofits that's trying to do something about global warming in oceans. And she had this baby that had a very complex brain tumor. And I'm sorry about that T-shirt there. I didn't realize that was in the picture. Hey, cancer, go blank yourself. But that's the kind of person she was. And so she wrote me this love letter, and it kind of expresses what a lot of parents and patients feel. It's, they're so dependent on us. And she wanted to express to me and others why her heart will forever be there. And she goes through this. She loves Children's National for the people who provide its heart and soul. They take their job seriously and with passion, and they're everyday heroes. And there is a but. I didn't put the but part of this letter up here. But there's so much more we can do. Our care wasn't as coordinated as it needed to be. We weren't giving her as much of the input and communication as we weren't including her as part of the team. And that was a real wake-up call to me, because I thought we were. And so I thought, if we're going to be a great children's hospital and not just a good one, we needed to embrace what she was saying, that particularly for these children with complicated problems. And I met a couple of the nurse practitioners that work with the pediatric surgeons last night. I don't want to call them out. They may not be here this morning. But they were telling me some of the stories that go on here and how they help coordinate the care. And I think that's just so important. And so I've tried to create scenarios and ask parents all the time, well, what can we do better? How can we improve things? Because they know, and a lot of your front-line staff knows. And so we just roll. I'm just going to tell you a few examples, and I'm sure you got a bunch of them here. A lot of people said, a lot of the parents said, we don't know who's walking in our room. We have no idea what their role is. Is it the resident? Is it the surgeon? Is it a specialist? And so we just did this recently, but I'm a big baseball fan. So we now have baseball cards for all the people, and it's got their statistics, not their batting average maybe, but some statistics about them, and some humanizing things, but it's got their picture and what their role is. And so we hand those cards out, and it is just taken off. The kids love them. And so that's just an example. Another one I was talking about last night is I stole this from the adult world, where having nurse navigators has become a very common scenario. If you think about a woman that's just learned that she has breast cancer and trying to figure out all the different avenues and options, and the nurse navigator now helps people navigate that process. So I thought, well, we have a similar situation with our complicated kids, our complex kids. So I stole that idea from the nurse navigator, particularly for children, for example, with autism that need services at our hospital. Because if things aren't set up right, that can really trigger all sorts of things in that child and that family. So having a nurse navigator that knows what makes that child happy and how they can navigate the system has made all the difference. And that was actually brought to me, and I write about a story by a friend of mine who has a child with autism. And she came up to me in a party and said, look, you're just not doing things right. This is not good for kids and families because we just don't know how to deal with the hospital. And it's not a hospital that's set up for children with autism. So that's the kind of perspective. And I feel like that is very important here. And as you're designing these new facilities, I can see the great care that the leadership is taking to bring in other voices and the voice of the family. So that's a big one. Another thing I found to be helpful, and was so true, and I learned this really from being Dr. Randolph and being a surgeon, is the team and staying connected to the front lines. And I do it every which way I can. Some of it's, this is just an example of having a breakfast with different staff members and letting them, let it fly. Just tell me what's going on. It's very easy to get sort of into, we call it the fifth floor. I don't know what you call it here, but it's where the executive suite is. Kevin, you probably have one here. In fact, I decided not to put my office up there because I knew as soon as I did, and I made an unpopular decision, like taking the parking away from the surgeons or something. No, I'm sorry. But that I would, they'd say, look, he's gone over to the dark side. He's up there on the fifth floor. He's wearing that suit now. So I do everything I can to stay engaged because it really is about your team and about in surgery, for example, if the person handing you the instruments hadn't thought through the operation ahead of time, or the nurse that's making sure everything, or the anesthesiologist, and if you're not working in lockstep, things don't go well. And that's true of hospitals, and it's true of patients. If the team isn't working together, and including the family as part of the team. So, that's a pretty straightforward lesson. Now, I think this is a big one and so important for children's hospitals, and that's creating a healing environment. I think it's almost taken for granted, and I was joking with Don last night that most people think, when they think of a children's hospital, and that's not true here and it's not true in Washington, but they think of, how could you work in a place like that? It must be very depressing, all those tough stories with kids and all that. And if you've ever been in a children's hospital, it's anything but. You've got clowns and art and music, and just it creates that healing environment. And because children, they don't know what's going on. This is the only reality they know. So you want to make that experience as positive. And I truly believe, and I've seen it over and over again, there's just many things we don't know in medicine and we'll never know, whether it's, the spirituality, or there are just so many ways that people can heal. And so my view is that we want to just take advantage of everything we can to make that a kind of environment for people. Now, we've been fortunate enough, this is just a little bragging, but Ryan Seacrest, does anybody know who Ryan Seacrest is? I don't know if anybody watches American Idol anymore. Is it still on? Anyway, Ryan Seacrest, he had the idea, he wanted to create these music and TV studios in children's hospitals. So this is ours, and you see all the kids there producing a show. And this just happens to be a good friend of mine here. That's Katie Ledecky, the great women's swimmer, Olympic swimmer. She happened to grow up across the street from me, or from my kids, and our families are very close. And her parents credit me, not with coaching her swimming, but encouraging her not to be a soccer player. She wasn't very good, but when she won 4 or 5 Olympic medals in the last, and she was just the women's athlete of the year. But we bring people in, and then the kids get to produce shows and ask questions, and that's the kind of thing that happens here. And as you begin, and I'm not sure where you exactly are on the planning, but I know as you're thinking about this new inpatient, can I talk about that? Then the new inpatient tower for children here that's going to be just so important about the next phase of children's health here in Tennessee. You're starting to think about that, about what goes into it and what are the kinds of things beyond the healthcare part that are going to make things so nice and wonderful for children. And that's really going to be exciting to see, because you have such a tremendous opportunity to take advantage of this. This is another one. We're not as able to have a outdoors environment like you are here. We're in this urban setting, so we created something called a healing garden. And again, this is where philanthropy is so important. So some of you young doctors that are going to make millions of dollars, you need to give them back to the Children's Hospital. No, I'm just kidding. You probably have to pay back your loans. But philanthropy was so important for us to create a garden where children and families, this child had never been outside before, and we have things. And here's Mrs. Trump. She helped cut the ribbon on our garden, and she is just very passionate about children and their issues, and it was just such a wonderful day when we opened that garden. I think another one, and this is maybe a little bit more on the medical side, is to create that quality and safety culture and be transparent about it. We are just relentless now about, and these are in the pediatric world. I know it's probably further advanced in the adult world around the different health-acquired or hospital-acquired situations that happen, whether they're drug events or urinary tract infections or breathing tubes coming out or bloodstream infections, surgical site infections, but to drive these down to zero where we can. And then to be as transparent about the results, to be sure that the team and our patients and families are involved with it. And I think that's one of the things I can bring as a physician, as a surgeon. It could be a nurse, could be an administrator, is to have that intense focus on how we can do better. And this is what I look at every day. This is just a spreadsheet of the issues on a monthly basis. I happened to get this one on, I guess, last week. And so we're just trying to sense and get a daily or monthly aspect of where we are with, and what happened here with unplanned extubations. Why was there that jump? And you can just see the different trends trying to eliminate codes. And then these were codes outside the ICUs. And then we said, well, what about inside? And so we started measuring that and trying to move that down. And so different things will come along, but everybody's has access to this, because we want to, as it says on the top of the chart, we want to get to zero harm. And then I'm sure if I walked through this hospital, I'd see similar things, but these are quality boards. The nurses and doctors on those units are working on improving things. We have these monitors that come right out of the electronic health record that indicate, and every parent, anybody can see whether the bundles were done on that child that day, and if not, they can ask why. And I think this is so important too. These are board members, so they, on a monthly basis, several board members will make walk-arounds into the hospital, because we want to make sure from the top to the bottom that quality and safety are a part of what we do. And that translates into, and these processes translate into good outcomes and results. And I can prove it. When I came in as CEO, I told people, I said, look, if we concentrate on this kind of thing and really provide the best quality and safety, the finances will follow. I'm not sure anybody totally believed me on that, but it's turned out to be true, and we've never been stronger financially, because it starts getting recognized and people start coming to you because they know they're going to get the great kind of care and results that they deserve. And so this past year, and I'm going to brag a little bit, but again, we were ranked as a top 10 children's hospital, U.S. News and World Report. Now, that is not the be-all and end-all, because it's only 10 specialties. and it doesn't measure a lot of the things that we do and you do, like primary care, mental health. None of that is embodied in the U.S. News and World Report. And I think that kind of can tend to skew what people do. But we are there, and our neonatology unit was ranked #1 in the country, and I know your chief of neonatology was here, so she knows what an achievement that was by Dr. Steinhorn, Dr. Short, and some of your colleagues and all the nurses. But there's one over here I'm proud of, the Leapfrog. The top Fortune 500 companies got together and said, we want to leapfrog forward into safety. And so those are those measures. And then here, I always tell people, if you have to be, if you want to look for something that's really important about healthcare or what you're going to get in the hospital, is Magnet. And that's a nursing accreditation. And we've been Magnet for the last 6 years, and I'm just proud of the nurses on that. Now, another lesson I learned is to, and I feel that here in Chattanooga with what you all are doing, and that's to try and have the broadest possible impact and not just focus on what happens inside the hospital. And this is Washington, D.C., and I think one of the really embarrassing things, if you will, and almost sad things, is that in our nation's capital we have the kind of poverty and disparities of care that we have. And it's almost a tale of, people say, two rivers. So everybody knows the Potomac River, which is this one here, and that's Virginia and Maryland, and then this is the District of Columbia. And we get patients from all over, but I'm just going to concentrate right now on the district. There's a second river, and that is this one here. It's called the Anacostia River. And look at what happens on one side of the Anacostia River and the other. So this is a measure. This the red is the poverty level, and the amount of well, I'll just below the poverty line, and you can't read it, but it's 30 to 50% of the people that live here are below the poverty line. Just think about that. And then here it's 0 to 17%, and then the yellow is 16 to 30%. So, and if we looked at children, it would be even higher. About the amount of poverty that's over here, and then poverty usually means other social determinants of care. So whether it's hunger and access to food, or education issues, or illness. And in our case, about 60% of the children in the District of Columbia are covered by Medicaid. So think about that. Our nation's capital, 60% of the children there are covered by Medicaid. So we think of ourselves as this very prosperous, wealthy country, but there's lots of pockets of things that we can do better. And I know that's true here in Chattanooga and in Tennessee. And I think that's what one of the great things about a hospital like Erlanger and Children's National is that we're not sitting back. We're trying to figure out how we can do more. And we've done that in our community. These are a couple of the clinics that we provide in that part of Washington, and these two over here. And then here's an adult hospital. It's a safety net hospital. But we decided to put an emergency department over there as a point of access to care. We built it for 10,000 visits. It's seeing 30,000 visits. And it's just an incredible kind of look at the issues of access and how children, even when you think you're doing a great job, you're not providing the access that they need in certain communities. And we have a mobile van. I'm not sure if you probably have these that go out into the community, and whether it's this one happens to be around dental, and that's such an important part of children. It's such a huge chronic disease that can lead to a lot of other things, and we got some grants here, and it drives around. I don't know where they got the bear to drive the bus, but where families aren't getting the health care that they need to provide that access. And another thing we've done is to work with the with the school system, and now we provide the school nurse program, and that's such a great place to be able to impact care. So the whole idea is to look for ways to provide the broadest possible impact for children. And with this program, we drove the immunization rate of going into school, which 10 years ago, now think about this, was only 60% of the kids had all their immunizations. 60%. So now it's at about 95%. And these are, basic immunizations. One of the things I've worked hard to do was to empower our physicians and nurses as partners in what we do, as strategic partners, because I don't think that hospitals and organizations are going to be successful unless there's partnerships. So anybody that was at Vanderbilt in the last, maybe starting about 5 years ago and back, might know Marshall Summer, who was the chief of genetics at Vanderbilt for many years, and he's now in Washington and has organized something we call the Genetics and Metabolism Rare Disease Institute. Now, we were running out of space, and I told Marshall one day, I said, there's a military base that's closing up in Washington, Walter Reed Army Medical Center, that the government decided to close that base. I said, do you think you can go out there and check it out and see if there's a possibility that we could get some of that space for a research institute? So if you know Dr. Summer, he is the kind of guy, he went out and he lobbied, he worked with, and this is there's a congressman in D.C., she can't vote in Congress, but she's Eleanor Holmes Norton, very strong advocate. And about 2 years later, so here's the headline, the United States Army transferred about 12 acres of land from that campus to Children's National for a research and innovation campus that we're going to build on that site. Now, it's a historic site. That's where Walter Reed did all his research about yellow fever. All the Army soldiers that were hurt in many, many wars were cared for at Walter Reed. So there's this incredible tradition of healthcare on that site. And it's so meaningful that we were able to get 12 acres of that. The rest of it's going for commercial development, the State Department, and all that kind of thing. But what I love about this picture, and this is where we're transferring the picture, and there's Marshall, and there's me with the deed. Here's the Undersecretary of the Army, the Congress, the City Council, our board chair, and other people. But I just love these flags in the back. Now, everybody knows the United States flag there. This is the District of Columbia flag. This is the United States Army flag. And then look over here. There's the bear flag, Children's National. And look at how the bear is looking over my shoulder. I don't know who took that picture, but it's almost worthy of a Pulitzer Prize, I think. And here's what it's going to look like. Well, we've got the building here, and we're building this culture of innovation and entrepreneurship. So you always want to be thinking about, what's next? What can we do next? What breakthroughs are we going to make? I know that's happening in pediatric surgery here, in pediatrics and in surgery, and I can feel the academic. That's why people throw around the word academic. I think it's basically, for me, it's a code word that you're really trying to do things better, that you're always challenging yourself. It'd be easy not to train the next generation of people, but you all have chosen to do that. And they precious. Young people ask questions, and you want to listen to those questions, because in those questions there's a lot of answers and solutions. And that's what we want to provide here with this research center. This is just a picture of what a mock-up of what the building looks like now. I have to tell you that this part of the building was built to withstand a nuclear bomb blast in Washington, D.C. I think they thought the president could ride it out here. I don't think anything could do that anymore, but this is what we want to create in this building. We have 15 companies that we've spun off from our research, and just young people with different ideas about, and these companies are going to be based out there, and you can just see the different ideas that people have had that they're working on out of our research enterprise. And then finally, I think as a CEO, a leader, I feel it's really, really important, and I know that all of you are doing this as well, but to speak up for kids. I was troubled during the debates this past summer around Medicaid and all the health policy. You didn't hear much about children. And that really worries me is that we need, in all of the debates, we need to think more and more about the children and how we're investing in children. So I've written a couple of things about that, and the leadership of children's hospitals in this New York Times article, this New York Times advertisement. We came together and tried to get people focused on that. But when you do that, you can have good results. So I think it's important when there are good results to talk about them. So having Congress and the President sign legislation that extended the CHIP program, which covers 9 million children in the United States, for 10 years is a good thing. We should be proud of that we did that. Or that increased the NIH budget by a couple $2 billion this year. And a lot of that was going to children's research. Those things are good, but there's more to do. And if you think about it, and I wrote this article, and I'm not advocating one thing or another, but it's just asking the question. There's Medicare covers everybody over 65 no matter what, but that's not the same for Medicaid. And why is that? That seems backwards. If you wanted to cover everybody, you'd cover your children. So those are the kinds of things I think we want to continue to be a spokesperson for that. And, the kids these days, there's just so much that they have to deal with. And this week is an example of things that can go wrong, whether it's mental health or whether it's everything that's going on with the opioid situation, or it's what kids see on their phones and the digital, all of that stuff. This is an intense environment for our children and our families. And so there's much, much more that we can do. And being in Washington, D.C., and being the Children's Hospital there, I feel like it's a important responsibility. And I believe that that's probably true for you all here, that being a spokesperson for the children in Tennessee and beyond. Because you're seeing the front lines, you see the issues, you see what the families are going through, and this is our future. And so I think it's so important to invest in our future. So with that, I will make another little plug here. All the proceeds of this book go to research, but the reason I wrote it, and it sounds kind of biographical, and it could be looked at as being very egotistical to write a book where you're, your own stories and things. But the goal was to help people understand what we do as pediatricians, specialists, Children's Hospital, to understand that special value that you're providing. A lot of people really don't know that. And they wind up, and this is what really used to get me, and I don't know if it happens to you, but I'm sure it does, where I'd get phone calls from parents, friends of mine, and they'd be in a situation, they'd be in an emergency department that didn't have what was needed for that child. Or they'd be with a specialist that didn't know the difference for a concussion for a 14-year-old versus a 22-year-old, and would, be making some decisions that weren't quite right, or they'd be having their baby that might have some problems in a hospital that just wasn't prepared, didn't have a NICU that where people knew what to do like they do here. I saw that over and over again, and it's not those people's fault, but they just didn't know, and people weren't telling them. So that was the purpose behind it, to try and empower parents, to empower people. And if you look at the back of the book, there's a little section about the 8 ways that people could find out things in advance. Know where that emergency department is that takes care of children, like right here. Drive the route in advance. You know your kids are going to have a problem at some point. Ask your pediatrician who they refer to. Make sure that specialist has experience with and operates with an anesthesiologist that knows how to take care. These are fundamental things sometimes we just take for granted. So without belaboring that, that's really was the purpose, and it was through stories to educate people and try and help people understand how special it is what you all do here. Please don't take that for granted. It's not what happens across the rest of the United States or even around the world. What you have here is so, so special. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention and having me here in Chattanooga. It's just been wonderful. Thank you very, very much.
Dr. Newman, thank you very much. It really makes all of us feel good, especially us surgeons, to see somebody go from the OR to leadership in a much broader sense, and very impressed with what you've done. And I know Judge Randolph, God rest his soul, about 3 years dead. I know he was proud of you, and certainly we are. We're especially proud to have all of our pediatric colleagues here too. We need to try to do this more often, get together. This is a wonderful tribute to the institution to get us all together for the benefit of the institution and especially for children. Thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you.